One dance can say what a lifetime of words never could. I stood at the edge of that crowded gala, my black dress clinging to me like a shadow of grief, watching him across the room. Thomas, my late husband's business partner, all sharp lines and guarded eyes, stood alone, his silhouette framed by the chandelier's golden glow. He was older, weathered by years of restraint, but there was something in the way his gaze lingered on me. It wasn't pity. It wasn't condolence. It was something heavier, something forbidden, something that made my pulse quicken in a way I hadn't felt in months. I felt it too, that pull, like a thread stretched so tight between us it could snap with a single wrong move. My fingers tightened around the stem of my wine glass, the cool crystal grounding me against the warmth spreading through my chest. I shouldn't have been there. 6 months after losing Michael, I was still raw, still waking up to an empty bed, his cologne fading from the pillows, his laughter an echo I chased in my dreams. Everyone said I was brave for showing up to the charity gala, but I wasn't brave. I was reckless, teetering on the edge of something I couldn't name. And when Thomas's eyes met mine across that sea of strangers, I knew I was crossing a line I could never uncross. He didn't approach me right away. He never would have. Thomas was too careful, too bound by the rules of propriety, by the ghost of Michael's memory that hung over us both. But the band started playing, a slow, aching waltz, the kind that wraps around your heart and squeezes, and something shifted. I saw it in the way his shoulders tensed, the way his fingers curled around his glass, the amber liquid inside catching the light. He wanted to ask me. I could feel it, the unspoken question hanging in the air like a dare. And God help me, I wanted him to. My breath caught as he set his glass down, his movements deliberate, almost reluctant, like he was fighting himself with every step. When he finally crossed the room, each footfall measured, my heart pounded so loud I was sure everyone could hear it, sure it was betraying everything I'd ever known. May I have this dance? His voice was low, rough, like he'd been holding the words back for years, each syllable scraped from some hidden place inside him. I should have said no. I should have turned away, walked out into the night, and left this moment behind. But my hand found his, warm and steady, and in that single touch, we broke every rule except the one in our hearts. My fingers trembled as they settled in his palm, and I wondered if he could feel it, the way my body was screaming yes while my mind whispered no. What if the love of your life was never meant to be yours? That's what I felt as we moved together onto the dance floor, his hand resting lightly on my waist, my breath caught in my throat. One dance, one fleeting moment, and yet it held everything we'd never said, everything we could never say. The world around us faded, the clinking glasses, the murmured conversations, the swirl of silk dresses, all of it dissolved until it was just us, swaying to a melody that felt like it was written for our silence. The gala was a blur of extravagance and forced laughter, the kind of event Michael would have hated with every fiber of his being. He was never one for pretense, always rolling his eyes at the pomp of these charity balls, but he'd have been here anyway, charming the room with that easy smile of his hand resting lightly on my back as if to say, we're in this together. Now I was alone, or at least I thought I was. The weight of his absence pressed against me, heavier than the diamond necklace I'd worn to feel something, anything, other than the hollow ache of grief. It glittered against my collarbone, cold and sharp, a reminder that I was still here, still breathing, even if I didn't know how. I'd known Thomas for years, but never like this, never in a way that made my skin prickle with awareness. He was Michael's shadow, the steady hand behind their business, always in the background, always watching. He was older, maybe 15 years my senior, but age didn't define him. It was his quiet intensity, the way he carried himself like he was holding something back, something too big to let slip. I'd caught glimpses of it before, in stolen glances during late-night meetings at the office, or the way he'd lingered just a moment too long when he dropped off papers at our house. But Michael was always there, filling the space between us with his laughter, his warmth, his unshakable presence, and I'd never let myself wonder what those glances meant. I'd never let myself linger on the way Thomas's voice softened when he said my name, or the way his eyes seemed to see more than I wanted them to. That night, though, Michael wasn't there. The gala was for a cause he'd cared about, children's literacy, something he'd poured his heart into, always saying that every kid deserved a chance to escape into a story. I'd come to honor him, or maybe to prove to myself that I could still exist without him, that I could stand in a room full of people and not fall apart. But the room was suffocating, filled with people who knew me only as Michael's widow, their pitying smiles cutting deeper than their words. I was 29, too young to be defined by loss, but too broken to care about their whispers. They didn't know me, not really. They didn't know the nights I spent clutching Michael's old sweater, trying to hold on to the scent of him, or the mornings I woke up reaching for a hand that wasn't there. They didn't know how hard it was to breathe in a world that kept moving without him. Thomas stood by the bar, his dark suit impeccable, his face unreadable, like a statue carved from restraint. He'd always been like that, stoic, controlled, the kind of man who never let his emotions slip, not even when Michael's illness took hold, not even at the funeral when I could barely stand. But I knew better. I'd seen the way his jaw tightened when Michael talked about me, the way his eyes softened when I laughed at some silly joke over dinner. It wasn't obvious to anyone else, but I felt it, like a secret only we shared, a current running beneath the surface of every interaction. I sipped my wine, the tartness sharp on my tongue, trying to focus on the chatter around me, some donor talking about tax write-offs, a woman complaining about her heels, but my gaze kept drifting to him. He was talking to someone, probably another donor, his posture stiff, his smile polite but distant. And then his eyes flicked to me, just for a second, and it was enough to make my stomach twist, a knot of guilt, and something else I didn't want to name. I told myself it was the wine, the grief, the loneliness that made me feel like the room was tilting. But it wasn't. It was him, and the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in months. The band shifted to a slower song, the notes soft and mournful, and the crowd thinned on the dance floor, leaving it exposed under the chandelier's glow. I felt naked, like everyone could see the thoughts I was trying to bury, the ones that whispered maybe I wasn't as broken as I thought, maybe there was something left in me that could still feel. I should have left then, slipped out the side door before I did something stupid, before I let myself feel something I had no right to feel. But I stayed rooted to the spot, because part of me wanted to know what would happen if I didn't run, if I let myself stand at the edge of this precipice and look down. When Thomas finally approached, it felt inevitable, like the moment had been building for years and I was only now seeing it clearly. His steps were slow, deliberate, each one giving me a chance to turn away, to pretend I didn't see him coming. But I didn't move. His eyes held mine, and there was something raw in them, something that made my chest ache with a pain I couldn't name. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it, like he was afraid of the words themselves. I hesitated, my mind screaming at me to say no, to think of Michael, to think of what people would say if they saw us. But my body moved before my mind could catch up, and my hand was in his, warm and steady, pulling me into a moment I couldn't escape. As we stepped onto the dance floor, the world blurred, the edges softening until it was just us, moving to the rhythm of a song that felt like it was written for our silence. His hand rested lightly on my waist, and I could feel the heat of it through the thin fabric of my dress, a warmth that spread through me like a forbidden promise. My breath hitched, and I wondered if he could hear my heart pounding, if he could feel the way my body leaned into his, just a little, against my better judgment. I wondered if he felt the same pull, the same reckless need to let go of everything holding us back. The dance was slow, deliberate, each step a confession we couldn't voice. Thomas's hand on my waist was firm but careful, like he was afraid to hold me too tightly, afraid I might break, or maybe afraid he would. I kept my eyes on his chest, on the crisp white of his shirt, the faint shadow of his collarbone beneath it, because looking into his eyes felt too dangerous, like I'd see something I couldn't unsee. But even without looking, I could feel him, his presence, his warmth, the weight of years unspoken between us, heavy as the air before a storm. Every movement was measured, every turn precise, but there was an undercurrent of something wild, something that made my skin hum with awareness. I thought of Michael, of the way he'd laugh and pull me onto the dance floor at events like this, his steps carefree, his hands sure, never doubting my love or the life we'd built together. He'd spin me until I was dizzy, his grin wide enough to light up the room, and I'd laugh until my sides ached. But now, with Thomas so close, I felt like I was betraying him with every step, every breath, every heartbeat that quickened under Thomas's touch. And yet I couldn't stop, couldn't pull away, couldn't break the spell of this moment. Do you ever think about him? Thomas's voice was low, barely audible over the music, a quiet rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. It wasn't an accusation, but it cut through me all the same, sharp and precise, like a blade slipping between my ribs. Every day, I said, my voice trembling, barely holding together. I didn't trust myself to say more, didn't trust that I wouldn't unravel right there in his arms. He nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder, and I wondered what he was holding back. Did he feel guilty too? Did he know how wrong this was, how every step we took together was a step away from the man we'd both loved, each in our own way? Or was he as lost in this moment as I was, caught in a current neither of us could fight? The music swelled, the violins rising in a slow, aching crescendo, and he pulled me closer, just a fraction, but it was enough to make my breath catch in my throat. Our bodies were inches apart, and yet it felt like there was no space at all, like the air itself had thickened with everything we weren't saying. I could smell his cologne, something woody and sharp, so different from Michael's warm, citrusy scent, and it grounded me, reminded me this wasn't a memory, wasn't a dream. This was real, and it was happening now, and I was letting it happen. I risked a glance at his face, and what I saw made my heart stutter. His eyes were dark, intense, filled with something that looked like longing and pain and restraint all at once, a storm held back by sheer force of will. He was holding himself together, but barely, and I could see the cracks in his armor, the way his lips parted slightly, the way his fingers tightened on my waist for just a moment before loosening again. I wanted to ask him what he was thinking, what he'd always thought when he looked at me like that, when he'd stood in our kitchen late at night, papers in hand, his eyes lingering just a second too long. But I didn't. I was too afraid of the answer, too afraid of what it would mean if he said it out loud. Instead, I let the silence speak. Our steps were perfectly in sync, like we'd danced this way 1,000 times before, like our bodies knew something our minds refused to admit. But we hadn't. This was our first dance, and I knew, deep down, it would be our last. The thought made my chest ache, a dull, persistent pain that felt like grief but wasn't, not quite. It was something sharper, something that cut deeper because it was alive, because it was happening now, and I was choosing it. Do you ever wonder? He started, his voice so soft it was almost lost in the music, and then he stopped, his lips pressing together, as if he regretted the words the moment they left him. I waited, my heart pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it, but he didn't finish. He didn't need to. I knew what he meant. Do you ever wonder what could have been? Do you ever think about us, about the life we might have had if things were different, if Michael hadn't been there, if the world hadn't drawn these lines between us? I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell him I'd wondered about him more than I should, that I'd noticed the way he lingered in doorways, the way his voice softened when he said my name, the way his eyes seemed to carry a weight I could never quite decipher. I wanted to tell him I'd felt it too, this pull, this impossible thing that lived in the spaces between us. But I couldn't. Not here, not now, not ever. The song was nearing its end, the notes slowing, softening, and I felt a panic rising in me, a desperate need to hold on to this moment, to freeze time and stay here, where nothing was decided, where we could pretend the rules didn't exist. But the music slowed to a whisper, and his hand loosened on my waist, and I knew it was over. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough, raw, and I couldn't tell if he meant for the dance or for something more, something bigger. I nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight with everything I wanted to say but couldn't. I stepped back, my hands slipping from his, and the air felt cold without him, sharp and unforgiving, and I hated how much I noticed it, how much I missed his warmth already. As I turned to walk away, I felt his eyes on me, heavy and unyielding, like a weight I'd carry forever. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I knew he was watching, and I knew what it cost him to let me go, just as I knew what it cost me to keep walking. The crowd swallowed me, their faces a blur of smiles and small talk, but my mind was still on the dance floor, still caught in that moment where everything was possible and nothing was allowed. My skin still burned where his hand had been, a ghost of a touch that wouldn't fade. I moved through the rest of the gala like a ghost myself, smiling when I had to, nodding at condolences, answering questions about how I was holding up. But every word felt hollow, every gesture mechanical, because my heart was still back there, swaying to that slow, aching waltz, caught in the space between what was and what could never be. I found a quiet corner near the balcony, the cool night air a shock against my flushed skin, a relief I didn't deserve. I leaned against the railing, closing my eyes, trying to picture Michael, to anchor myself to him, to the life we'd had, the love that had been so certain, so unshakable. But all I could see was Thomas, his guarded eyes, his careful touch, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the room, like I was something he'd been searching for his whole life. It wasn't fair. I'd always known he cared about me, in some quiet, unspoken way. It was in the small things, the way he'd check in after Michael's late nights at the office, his voice gentle on the phone, asking if I needed anything. It was in the way he'd bring me coffee when I was buried in work, setting it on my desk with a quiet, "Don't stay up too late," like he knew I wouldn't listen. It was in the way he'd stand just a little too close when we talked, his presence steady, grounding, even when I didn't realize I needed it. But I'd never let myself think about it, not really. Michael was my world, my safe harbor, my everything, and Thomas was his friend, his partner, the man who'd stood by us through every triumph and loss, who'd been there when Michael got sick, who'd held my hand at the hospital when I couldn't stop shaking. But now Michael was gone, and the space he'd left was vast and empty, a void I didn't know how to fill. And Thomas was still here, still standing in the background, still watching me with those eyes that saw too much. I hated myself for noticing, for feeling anything at all. I was supposed to be grieving, supposed to be honoring Michael's memory, not standing here with my heart racing, my skin tingling from a touch that should never have happened. What was this? Longing? Betrayal? Something worse, something I couldn't name because naming it would make it real. I heard footsteps behind me, soft but deliberate, and my heart leapt before I could stop it. I knew it was him before I turned around, knew it in the way the air shifted, the way my body seemed to hum with his presence. Thomas stood there, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, God, his eyes, were raw, unguarded, like he'd finally let the mask slip. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me, and I felt exposed, like he could see every thought I was trying to hide, every feeling I was trying to bury. "I shouldn't have asked you to dance," he said finally, his voice low, rough, like the words were being pulled from him against his will. "It was inappropriate." I shook my head, my throat so tight I could barely speak. "It wasn't," I said, and the words came out before I could stop them, raw and honest. He looked surprised, just for a moment, and then his face softened, and I saw it again, that look that made my chest ache, that made me want to reach for him and run from him all at once. "You don't know what you're saying," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice, only a quiet desperation, like he was trying to convince himself more than me. "I do," I whispered, and I meant it. I didn't know what I was doing, didn't know how to navigate this impossible space between us, but I knew what I felt. And it was terrifying and exhilarating and wrong all at once, a collision of guilt and desire that left me dizzy. He took a step closer, and I held my breath, the space between us charged, electric, like a storm waiting to break. "I've spent years not saying it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, each word heavy with the weight of everything he'd held back. "Years telling myself it was enough to just be near you." My heart stopped, the world tilting beneath me. He'd never said it, not in all the years we'd known each other, but I'd felt it, hadn't I? I'd felt it in the way he looked at me, in the way he lingered, in the way he'd always been there, steady and quiet, a constant I hadn't realized I'd come to rely on. And now, hearing it, I didn't know whether to run or to stay, whether to lean into this moment or push it away. Thomas, I started, but I didn't know how to finish, didn't know what to say to a confession that changed everything. That I'd felt it too? That I was scared of what it meant? That I was still in love with Michael, still tied to him, but somehow, impossibly, I was feeling something for Thomas too, something that had been there all along, waiting for a moment like this to break free? He shook his head, like he could hear the chaos in my mind. Don't, he said, his voice sharp but soft, a plea. Don't say anything. It's better that way. But it wasn't. Nothing about this was better. It was messy and painful and real, and I didn't know how to let it go, didn't know how to walk away from this moment without leaving a piece of myself behind. I wanted to reach for him, to close the distance between us, to feel his hand on mine again, but I couldn't. Not here, not now, not with Michael's memory hanging over us like a specter, not with the weight of what people would say, what they'd think, what I'd think of myself. I should go, I said, my voice breaking, barely holding together. He nodded, but his eyes didn't leave mine, dark and searching, like he was memorizing me, like he knew this was the last time. You should, he said, but his voice was hollow, and neither of us moved. We stood there, caught in the silence, in the weight of everything we weren't saying, everything we couldn't say. And then, slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing mine, just for a moment, so light it was barely a touch, but it felt like a promise, like a confession, like everything we couldn't have. The warmth of his skin against mine lingered, a fleeting connection that burned itself into my memory. And then he let go, and I felt the loss of it like a physical ache, a wound that opened up and refused to close. I left the gala that night, my heart heavy with what I'd left behind, with the weight of a moment that had changed me forever. Thomas didn't follow me, and I didn't expect him to. We'd crossed the line, but we hadn't stepped over it completely, hadn't let it consume us. Maybe that was the worst part, the knowing, the wanting, the almost that hung between us like a ghost. In the days that followed, I replayed that dance in my mind, over and over, until it felt like a dream I couldn't wake from, a memory that was both a comfort and a curse. I saw Thomas's face, his eyes, the way he'd held me like I was something precious and forbidden all at once, something he could never claim. I wondered what would have happened if I'd stayed, if I'd let myself say the things I'd buried for so long, if I'd let myself lean into that impossible pull. But I didn't. I couldn't. Michael's memory was still too real, too raw, a tether that held me to a life that no longer existed. And Thomas was a part of that world, a part of Michael, a reminder of everything I'd lost and everything I couldn't have. To love Thomas would be to betray Michael, and I wasn't ready to let go of either of them, wasn't ready to choose between the past and a future that could never be. I never saw Thomas again. He sent a letter a few weeks later, formal and distant, the kind of letter you'd expect from a business associate, not a man who'd held you like you were his only chance at salvation. He said he was stepping back from the business, moving to another city, starting over somewhere new. He didn't mention the dance, or the balcony, or the way his fingers had brushed mine, but I felt it in every word he didn't write, in the spaces between his careful sentences. I read that letter 100 times, tracing the lines of his handwriting, looking for something I couldn't name. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the weight of my own thoughts is too much, I close my eyes and I'm back on that dance floor, his hand on my waist, his breath warm against my cheek, the music wrapping around us like a secret we could never keep. I wonder if he thinks of it too, if he carries that moment like I do, a quiet wound that never quite heals, a memory that's both a treasure and a torment. What if the love of your life was never meant to be yours? That's the question that haunts me, the one I'll never answer, the one that lingers in the silence of every night since. Have you ever felt a connection you couldn't act on? Share your story in the comments. If this moved you, share it with someone who gets it. What's the one moment you'll never forget? Let us know below.